I didn't wear my best coat that day. I chose the old beige cardigan instead, the one with a loose thread near the cuff and a faint stain I never quite managed to remove. I carried a worn canvas bag, the kind you'd expect to see at a farmer's market, not in front of a five-star restaurant glowing with crystal lights and polished marble floors. I remember standing outside for a moment, steadying my breath. Through the glass doors, I could already see them, my son, straight-backed and proud in his tailored jacket, and my daughter-in-law beside him, flawless, confident, already at home in that world of white tablecloths and soft music. This wasn't an accident, it was a test. I had decided, quietly and deliberately, to arrive as the version of myself they expected least. A poor, naive mother with nothing to offer but love and old stories. No jewelry, no designer bag, no hint of the life I had built when no one was watching. I wanted to see how they would treat someone they believed had nothing. As I walked in, the hostess glanced at my bag, then at my shoes. Just for a second. Long enough for me to notice. She smiled anyway, professional, practiced, but already the hierarchy had been drawn. My daughter-in-law noticed too. Her eyes flicked down, then back up. The smile she gave me was polite, thin, like a door that only opens halfway. "Mom," my son said, standing to hug me. He smelled like expensive cologne and familiarity. "You found the place okay?" "I did," I said softly. "It's very beautiful." He didn't hear the weight in my voice, or maybe he chose not to. We sat. The menu was thick, heavy, intimidating. Prices that could make a pensioner flinch. I watched as my daughter-in-law spoke easily about wine pairings and chef recommendations, as if she belonged here by birthright. No one asked what I wanted to eat. When the waiter turned to me, she answered for me. "Oh, she'll have something light. She doesn't eat much." I smiled. I nodded. I played my part well. Inside, something tightened. Not pain exactly, but clarity. A quiet awareness settling into place. This was not rudeness born of accident. This was comfort, the kind that comes when people think they're above you. My daughter-in-law's parents arrived shortly after, well-dressed, confident, voices carrying the authority of people used to being listened to. Introductions were made, hands were shaken. Her mother looked at my cardigan. Her father glanced at my bag resting by my feet. "So," he said kindly, but not warmly, "what did you do before you retired?" "Oh," I replied, lowering my eyes just a little. "Just simple work. Nothing important." There it was, the invisible line. Conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They spoke of investments, properties, future plans for my son and their daughter. I was included only when necessary, questions that required polite acknowledgement, not real curiosity. At one point, her mother leaned toward my daughter-in-law and whispered something she thought I couldn't hear. "Well, at least he married for love." They laughed softly. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my face calm, my heart steady. They had no idea. They didn't know about the documents in my safe, the accounts with my name on them alone, the house my son believed belonged to the family, but legally, unmistakably, belonged to me. They didn't know that I had spent decades learning silence as a language, that I understood people best when they thought I was harmless. Across the table, my daughter-in-law glanced at me again, this time with something like relief. Relief that I was no threat. Relief that I had nothing. I met her eyes and smiled gently. In that moment, I made a promise to myself, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. I would remember every look, every word not spoken to me, every assumption made because they believed I was small, because when people show you how they treat the poor and naive, they are telling you exactly who they are, and I was listening. Some truths don't need announcements, banners, or witnesses. They settle quietly into the bones of a person, forming a structure so solid that even time learns not to question it. I lived my life built on those truths, unseen but unshakable. After that dinner, I returned to my modest apartment and placed the worn canvas bag on the chair near the door. City lights slipped through the window, stretching across the floor like tired thoughts. I didn't turn on the lamp right away. I rarely did. Darkness had never frightened me. It had taught me patience. This apartment was small by most standards, but it was intentional. Every object had earned its place. The wooden table carried decades of use. The bookshelf held volumes that shaped my thinking, not my image. On the shelf sat a single framed photograph of my son on graduation day, smiling with the unearned certainty of youth, convinced the world would meet him halfway. I smiled back at that photograph often, not because it comforted me, but because it reminded me why I had chosen silence so long ago. Few people knew who I used to be, and fewer still understood why I walked away from it without ceremony. Years ago, I sat in rooms with glass walls and long, polished tables where decisions were made that altered futures. I was not a figurehead. I was a senior executive, one of the last voices heard before final approval. I managed budgets that dwarfed what most families would see in a lifetime. I negotiated contracts with calm authority, knowing when to push and when to wait. I earned more in a month than many earned in a year. Yet even then, I learned early that visibility is not power. Control is, and control thrives best when no one is looking directly at it. When my husband died, my life split cleanly into before and after. Grief arrived, but it did not paralyze me. It sharpened me. My son was young, fragile in ways children never realize they are. I had no margin for collapse. I woke every morning with a plan, moved through each day with discipline, and reserved my softness for the moments that mattered. I became two people without ever announcing the transition. By day, I was precise, commanding respect without asking for it. By night, I was a mother reading stories, packing lunches, tying shoes, and listening to fears that only emerged after the lights were off. I never raised my son with the language of wealth. I raised him with the grammar of effort. He did not know what my job title was, only that I worked hard and came home tired. He did not know how much I earned, only that money was not something to be wasted or worshipped. I could have surrounded him with comfort so complete that he never learned hunger, but I chose restraint, not deprivation, but balance. I wanted him to understand that security comes from competence, not entitlement. I drove him to school myself, even on mornings when deadlines loomed and my phone buzzed relentlessly. I cooked dinners with my own hands, even when my mind was still solving problems from work. I sat through school performances, half listening to boardroom debates echoing in my head, but never letting my eyes drift from the stage. I taught him consistency, not luxury. Presence, not privilege. In those years I learned that discipline is not coldness, it is devotion expressed through structure. I lived simply because simplicity kept me invisible. Clothes were chosen for durability, not labels. My home reflected function, not aspiration. I owned one good watch, one reliable car, and no interest in impressing neighbors. They saw a quiet single mother, careful with money, living within limits. That perception protected me. Silence is a shield when used correctly. It grants you room to observe without being observed, to learn without revealing what you've learned. While others spoke openly about promotions and bonuses, I said nothing. While colleagues upgraded homes and chased status, I invested quietly. I studied markets with the same intensity I brought to my work. I diversified. I structured assets under my own name, carefully, legally, deliberately. I purchased property without fanfare. I planned not for growth alone, but for protection. Not because I mistrusted my son, but because I understood the world he would eventually step into. I had seen too much to believe that love alone shields families from conflict. I had watched siblings turn into adversaries over inheritances. I had seen gratitude morph into resentment the moment expectations formed. I understood that money changes conversations, even when no one admits it. So I made choices early. I kept boundaries clean. I ensured that nothing I built could be taken through assumption, pressure, or emotional leverage. There were nights when exhaustion settled deep into my bones, nights when my son slept soundly and the city outside pulsed with motion. I would sit by the window, cup of tea cooling in my hands, watching people rush past with urgency written into their posture. Everyone seemed to be chasing something just ahead of them. I never chased. I watched patterns instead. Ambition, fear, greed disguised as love, love disguised as obligation. The longer I observed, the clearer everything became. True power doesn't announce itself. It waits. It listens. It remembers. When retirement came, it arrived quietly. No farewell dinner. No speech recounting achievements. I closed one chapter and stepped into another without asking permission. Some colleagues were surprised, others relieved. Power makes people uneasy, especially when it belongs to someone who doesn't seek validation. I smiled, thanked them, and left. I had already extracted what I needed from that life. In retirement, my days slowed. I read, I cooked, I tended plants, I listened to the world instead of directing it. People assume this is decline. They are wrong. This is mastery. Knowing when to stop is as important as knowing how to begin. I had reached a point where my life no longer needed proof. My son, now grown, began constructing his own identity. He wanted more. That is natural. He met my daughter-in-law, a woman sharp enough to recognize opportunity and ambitious enough to pursue it. I saw her intelligence immediately. I also saw her assumptions. She valued momentum, not patience. Display, not discretion. There is nothing inherently wrong with that, but it told me everything I needed to know about how she would measure others. I did not interfere. I did not warn my son. Parents who interfere too early rob their children of necessary lessons. I trusted his path, even if I questioned its direction. I watched. I listened. I stored impressions carefully, like documents in a safe. I never spoke of my past leadership, never corrected misconceptions about my finances, never explained why I lived the way I did. People filled in the blanks themselves, and their conclusions were far more revealing than any confession I could have made. When people think you have nothing, they stop performing. That is when the truth appears. The dinner at the luxury restaurant did not shock me. It confirmed patterns I had already recognized, the glances, the assumptions, the relief. It was not cruelty. It was hierarchy operating without self-awareness. That is often more dangerous. I returned home that night without anger. Anger clouds judgment. I felt clarity instead. Calm, precise, irreversible clarity. People respect what they believe benefits them. Strip away perceived value, and respect evaporates. That knowledge is not bitter. It is liberating. Because once you understand it, you stop seeking approval from the wrong places. I stood in my quiet apartment, surrounded by a life that had never depended on applause. Everything I needed was already in place. Documents secure, decisions made long ago, boundaries intact. I had sacrificed loudly in my youth and silently ever since. I had given my son stability without dependency. I had built wealth without identity attached to it. That is why I did not fear what was coming next. Tests do not frighten those who prepared before the questions were written. I knew who I was long before anyone tried to define me differently, and I knew, with the certainty earned only through time, that strength revealed too early becomes a target, but strength held quietly becomes a shield. True power doesn't shout, it watches. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. Contempt rarely announces itself. It leaks into the room through tone, through questions disguised as curiosity, through smiles that linger half a second too long. By the time you recognize it, it has already decided where you belong. After that first dinner, the invitations continued. Different restaurants, larger tables, louder conversations. Each gathering followed the same quiet pattern, as predictable as it was revealing. They spoke more freely now, convinced they had already measured me. Wealth has a way of loosening people's tongues when they believe there is no risk. At one dinner, the table stretched long and polished, the kind that separates people physically and symbolically. I was seated at the end, far from the center of conversation, close enough to hear but far enough to be ignored. Crystal glasses clinked. Expensive watches caught the light with every gesture. The air was thick with performance. My daughter-in-law's father leaned back in his chair and laughed loudly as he spoke about a recent investment. Numbers were dropped casually, like confetti. Properties, returns, connections. He spoke not to inform, but to establish dominance. Each sentence was a reminder of where he believed power lived. Someone asked him how much he had made that year. He answered without hesitation. Pride sharpened his voice. Then, without missing a beat, his gaze slid toward me. "And you," he said, smiling thinly, "what kind of pension do you receive?" The table went quiet for a moment, not out of respect, out of anticipation. I felt every pair of eyes shift, measuring my response before I gave it. This was not conversation. This was inspection. "Oh," I said calmly, hands resting in my lap. "It's modest. Enough." The word enough seemed to disappoint them. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat. I saw it immediately. The color rose slightly in her cheeks. Not anger, not defense, embarrassment. She glanced at my son, waiting for him to intervene, to redirect the conversation, to say something, anything. He didn't. Silence can be louder than cruelty. His quiet felt heavier than the question itself. In that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. He was not choosing sides. He was choosing comfort. The questions continued, emboldened by my restraint. Where did I live exactly? Was it rented or owned? Did I manage on my own, or did my son help me financially? Each question stripped away another layer of assumed dignity. They asked with polite smiles, but their curiosity was not neutral. It was hierarchical. I answered simply, carefully, never defensively, never elaborating. Each response confirmed what they wanted to believe, that I was small, that I was dependent, that my presence at the table was courtesy, not equality. They began to speak over me. Decisions about future family trips were made without including me. Conversations shifted abruptly when I tried to contribute, redirected politely but firmly elsewhere. Laughter erupted at jokes I hadn't heard. I became furniture, present, functional, invisible. Across the table, my daughter-in-law avoided my eyes. Shame sat on her shoulders like an ill-fitting coat. She laughed when expected. She nodded at the right moments. But her body leaned away from me, as if proximity itself had become uncomfortable. She did not defend me, but she did not enjoy this either. Her silence was different from my son's. Hers came from fear of exposure. His came from fear of disruption. That distinction mattered. At another gathering, her mother commented on how simple my lifestyle was. She said it kindly, as if simplicity were a charming flaw. "Some people don't need much," she added, smiling at me like one smiles at a child. "It must be nice not having to worry about investments and assets." Nice. The word hovered between pity and dismissal. I nodded. "Peace is expensive," I replied quietly. They laughed, assuming it was a joke. The contempt grew bolder over time. They compared cars openly, praising one another's choices. They discussed renovations, upgrades, exclusive clubs. When I remained silent, they took it as confirmation of irrelevance. When I spoke briefly, they took it as interruption. Once, my daughter-in-law joked that I was refreshingly low maintenance. Everyone laughed. My son smiled, unsure. I smiled too, because low maintenance is another way of saying low expectation. Inside, something settled. Not anger, recognition. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not cultural difference or awkwardness. This was evaluation. They had assigned me a number, and in their minds, it was negligible. At the end of one particularly long dinner, I sat quietly as dessert plates were cleared. The conversation buzzed around me, plans and profits weaving together in a language designed to exclude. I looked down the length of the table, at faces flushed with wine and certainty, and felt an unexpected calm. "So, this is what you think I'm worth," I thought. Not money, not assets, worth. The realization did not wound me, it liberated me, because once someone shows you how they measure value, you no longer need to guess where you stand. My son finally caught my eye then, just for a second. There was something in his expression, confusion, maybe even guilt. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. The moment passed. Cowardice often hides behind timing. I did not blame him. Not yet. I understood the pressure he was under, the subtle coercion of belonging. Challenging his wife's family would mean challenging the life he was trying to build. Still, understanding does not erase consequence. I stood to leave before anyone else did. I gathered my coat, my old canvas bag. The movement caught their attention, briefly. Polite goodbyes followed, empty warmth, conditional smiles. As I walked away from the table, I felt lighter. The test was complete. Not because I had learned something new about them, but because they had stopped pretending. Contempt, once revealed, removes all ambiguity. It clarifies the path forward. That night, alone again in my quiet apartment, I did not replay the conversations with regret. I replayed them with precision. Each word, each pause, each glance exchanged over my head. Information had been offered freely because they believed there was no cost. They were wrong. Financial manipulation does not always begin with documents or demands. It begins with diminishment, with making someone feel smaller so resistance feels inappropriate, with teaching them subtly that gratitude should replace boundaries. I recognized the pattern immediately. I had seen it before, in boardrooms and families alike. Power seeks leverage. Leverage seeks weakness. And perceived poverty is an invitation. I poured myself tea and sat by the window, the city humming below. There was no sadness in me, only resolve, quiet and unyielding. I had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this without knowing it. They believed I was poor. They believed I was naive. They believed I was harmless. And because of that, they showed me everything I needed to see. The betrayal was not loud. It was not dramatic. It did not come with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived dressed in politeness, carried by smiles, and confirmed by silence. And now that it was visible, I could finally decide what came next. The invitation came wrapped in politeness, delivered with the same careful tone people use when they believe they are being generous. A quiet lunch, they said. Somewhere refined but discreet. A place where conversations could happen without interruption. I agreed without hesitation. When people are ready to negotiate, it is best to let them speak first. The restaurant was smaller than the others, private rooms tucked behind heavy wooden doors. The kind of place where deals are made over soft lighting and muted cutlery. When I arrived, they were already seated. My daughter-in-law's parents sat side by side, posture forward, hands folded as if rehearsed. My son sat slightly apart, shoulders tight, eyes unfocused. My daughter-in-law avoided looking at me altogether. That told me everything. We exchanged pleasantries, the usual, weather, traffic, the illusion of warmth. Tea was poured, menus opened and closed without discussion. No one intended to eat much. This was not a meal. This was a transaction. Her father cleared his throat. He smiled the way men do when they believe reason is on their side. "We've been thinking a lot about family," he began. "About what's best for everyone involved." I nodded slowly. I let him continue. "You've done so much for your son," her mother added. "Raising him alone couldn't have been easy. We admire that." Admiration offered too late is rarely sincere. My son shifted in his seat. His hands tightened around his glass. He still said nothing. Her father leaned forward. "We understand that retirement can be challenging. Expenses add up, and young couples today face enough pressure without additional responsibilities." There it was, framed gently, positioned as concern. "We thought," her mother continued, "that perhaps we could help ease things, financially." She slid a folder across the table toward me. It was neat, thick, legal-looking. The kind of folder meant to impress, to signal seriousness and authority. I did not touch it. Her father spoke again, voice low. "A monthly allowance, enough for comfortable living, no worries, no dependence." Allowance. The word hung between us, heavy with implication. "In return," he said carefully, We'd like to ensure that our children can focus on building their future without complications. Complications. That was me. The silence stretched. My daughter-in-law stared at the tablecloth. My son finally looked at me, eyes filled with something close to panic. He was waiting for me to react emotionally, to protest, to embarrass him. He underestimated me. "So," I said quietly, "you're offering to support me." Her mother smiled, relieved. "Exactly. Support. We all help family, don't we?" I tilted my head slightly. "And what would this support require of me?" They exchanged glances. Her father answered, "Nothing unreasonable. Just discretion. Independence. We wouldn't want misunderstandings or unnecessary involvement. It's better if everyone knows their place." There it was, stripped of ornament. I looked at the folder then, still untouched. "You want me to disappear?" I said calmly. Not accusing, observing. Her mother laughed softly, as if I'd exaggerated. "Oh, not disappear. Just step back. Step back from my son's life. Step back from decisions. Step back from presence. Step back into the margins where inconvenient mothers belong." My daughter-in-law finally looked up. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away. Shame, sharp and fleeting. She knew what this was. She just didn't want to name it. I leaned back in my chair. "You're not offering help," I said, my voice steady. "You're offering control." The room cooled instantly. Her father's smile tightened. "That's not fair," he replied. "We're trying to prevent future problems." "No," I said gently. "You're trying to purchase silence, and distance, and obedience." My son inhaled sharply. "Mom," he started, then stopped. The word hung unfinished. He looked between us, trapped. "They just want what's best." "For whom?" I asked, turning to him for the first time. My tone wasn't harsh. It didn't need to be. He couldn't answer. Her father spoke again, firmer now. "Let's be practical. You're not young anymore. Stability matters. Pride won't pay medical bills." I smiled then. A small, controlled smile. "You assume I'm unstable," I said, "because you assume I'm poor." His eyes flicked, just for a second. Confirmation. Her mother leaned in, voice dropping. "We don't want this to become uncomfortable. There's no need for conflict. This is generous." Generous. When generosity demands erasure, it has another name. I finally placed my hand on the folder and slid it back toward them, slowly, deliberately. "I didn't raise my son to be a bargaining chip," I said, "and I didn't survive my life to be managed." The tension thickened. The pleasant veneer cracked. Her father straightened, irritation bleeding through. "You're being unreasonable." "No," I replied. "I'm being clear." My daughter-in-law's face burned now. She whispered my son's name, a plea. He looked at her, then at me, torn between the woman who promised him a future and the mother who gave him one. "This could make things easier," he said quietly. Not to convince me, to convince himself. I stood up then, not abruptly. Calm movements unsettle people who rely on pressure. "If you believe money can buy my absence," I said, "then you've misunderstood everything about me." I picked up my canvas bag. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. "This conversation," I continued, "is not about support. It's about ownership, and I do not belong to anyone." I looked at my son one last time. "When you're ready to speak without permission," I said softly, "you know where to find me." And with that, I left them sitting there with their documents, their assumptions, and the uncomfortable realization that not everything valuable is for sale. They didn't stop after that lunch. People who believe money equals authority rarely accept refusal the first time. To them, resistance is not a boundary. It is a misunderstanding that needs correcting. The next move came quietly. No more invitations, no shared meals. Instead, messages, carefully worded, strategic. Concern disguised as logistics. My son called more often, his voice hesitant, rehearsed. He spoke about stress, about pressure, about how difficult married life could be when too many voices were involved. He never said my name directly, but every sentence pointed in my direction. "I just want peace," he told me one evening. "Everyone's tense. Peace." Another word people use when they want silence. I listened without interrupting. Silence unsettles those who expect persuasion to land somewhere. When he finished, I asked him one question. "Do you feel supported or managed?" He didn't answer. He said he'd call me back. He didn't. Then came the escalation. Her mother visited my apartment unannounced one afternoon, her perfume arriving before she did. She stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the room with thinly veiled assessment. The modest furniture, the clean simplicity, the absence of luxury she had already decided defined my worth. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, smiling too brightly, a lie wrapped in courtesy. I invited her in. Power does not require raised voices, it requires composure. She sat stiffly on the sofa, handbag clutched like a shield. "We were worried," she began, "about you being alone so much. It's not healthy at your age." Concern again, always concern. "I'm quite well," I replied. She nodded, unconvinced. "Still, life happens, emergencies, illness. It's important to have arrangements, plans." Her gaze flicked toward the cabinet where my documents were stored, though she didn't know it. She spoke of assisted living, of facilities, of how expensive they were, of how generous it was that they were willing to contribute. She spoke as if my future had already been decided, only awaiting my cooperation. "We don't want your son burdened," she said softly. "He has a family now." That sentence landed exactly where it was meant to. "I never burdened him," I replied. She smiled thinly. "Mothers rarely realize when they do." There it was, the blade beneath the silk. I stood and poured tea, my hands steady. "If you're concerned about my care," I said, "you may rest easy. It's already handled." Her eyes sharpened. "Handled how?" "Legally," I answered. The word made her shift. People who rely on informal pressure grow uncomfortable when formality enters the room. She tried a different approach. Guilt. "Do you know how people talk? A grown man still tethered to his mother. It doesn't look good." I met her gaze. "Neither does trying to erase one." Her visit ended shortly after that. What followed was isolation by design. Family gatherings happened without my knowledge. Decisions were made, announced later as fate's accomplice. My son began missing calls. When we spoke, his tone was distant, cautious, as if someone else might be listening. Control had shifted from persuasion to containment. This is how elder financial abuse often begins, not with theft but with repositioning. Redefining the elder as a problem to be managed, a cost to be minimized, a voice to be neutralized. Once that narrative is established, everything else becomes easier. Then came the paperwork. Another folder arrived by courier. No explanation, just documents. A proposed family agreement, clauses about living arrangements, financial oversight, power of attorney language buried deep in the text, written to look temporary, helpful, reversible. I read every word. Twice. They wanted authority, not help, access, not support, the ability to decide for me if necessary. I called my son. "Did you know about this?" I asked. A pause. Too long. "They're just planning ahead," he said finally. "For whom?" I asked again. He sighed. "Why are you making this difficult?" The question stung, not because it was cruel, but because it was learned. Someone else's frustration spoken through his mouth. "I'm not making it difficult," I said calmly. "I'm making it accurate." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence confirmed what words could not. That night, I sat alone at my table, documents spread before me, city lights blinking outside the window. I felt no fear, only disappointment, tempered by understanding. This was never about money alone. It was about hierarchy, about removing obstacles, about ensuring that influence flowed in one direction only. They believed I would eventually comply. That age, isolation, and pressure would do their work for them. They mistook restraint for weakness. They mistook politeness for surrender. They forgot one thing. I built my life inside systems more ruthless than family politics. I survived environments where power was negotiated daily, where contracts mattered, where clarity was the only protection. I knew exactly what this was, and I knew exactly how it ended. I gathered the documents, placed them neatly into my own folder, and locked them away. Then I made one call, not to my son, not to my daughter-in-law, to someone who understood language like this fluently, someone who recognized coercion when it wore a friendly face. The next phase would not be emotional, it would be procedural. They wanted to buy my disappearance. They wanted silence. They wanted control disguised as care. What they were about to learn was simple. Some women do not disappear when pressured. They document, they prepare, and they respond on their own terms. The meeting was framed as reconciliation. That was the word they used. A chance to clear misunderstandings. A neutral setting. Calm conversation. No pressure. When people say no pressure, it usually means the opposite. I agreed anyway, because by then I had already decided that the truth would no longer remain buried. The restaurant they chose resembled a law office more than a dining room. Dark wood, low lighting, clean lines, privacy built into every corner, the kind of place where people expect authority to sit comfortably. When I arrived, they were already there. My son, my daughter-in-law, her parents, all seated, all tense, all pretending this was a normal family discussion. I noticed immediately that the folder was back on the table, a different one this time, thinner, revised. They had softened the language, removed the sharper edges, control rewritten as cooperation, power disguised as partnership. They greeted me politely, too politely. When people are unsure of their footing, they become formal. We sat. No one reached for the menus. That told me they expected this to be brief. They still believed the outcome was negotiable. Her father spoke first. "We thought it would be good to talk openly," he said. "No assumptions, no misunderstandings." I nodded. "I agree." My son looked relieved. He thought agreement meant surrender. Children often mistake calm for concession. Her mother folded her hands. "We're worried about how tense things have become. It's not healthy for the family." Family. The word had been used so often it had lost its meaning. "I'm worried too," I said. "Which is why I'm glad we're finally speaking honestly." That unsettled them. Honesty was not the terrain they had prepared for. Her father leaned forward. "We don't want conflict. We just want clarity. About expectations. About boundaries." I smiled faintly. "So do I." There was a pause. They were waiting for me to react to something that hadn't yet been said. When I didn't, her father gestured toward the folder. "We revised the agreement. It's much more flexible, temporary, just to ensure everyone feels secure." Secure. Another word used when someone else wants to hold the keys. I didn't look at the folder. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed my own documents on the table. A slim leather portfolio. Elegant. Unassuming. The contrast caught their attention immediately. My daughter-in-law straightened. Her eyes flicked to the portfolio, then to my face. For the first time, she looked uncertain. "I thought," I said calmly, "before we discuss my future, you should understand my present." Her father frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I replied, "you've been negotiating from assumptions. It's time those assumptions were corrected." The air shifted. Even my son leaned forward now, confusion breaking through his composure. I opened the portfolio slowly. There is power in pacing. I removed a single page and placed it on the table, angled so everyone could see. It was not a bank statement, not a contract, just a summary, clear, verified, undeniable. "I earn $40,000 a month," I said evenly. "I always have." The sentence landed like a dropped glass. Sharp. Irreversible. No one spoke. My daughter-in-law's mother blinked, once, twice. Her father's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. My son stared at the page as if it were written in a foreign language. "That's impossible," her father said finally. His voice had lost its confidence. I met his gaze. "It's documented." I slid another page forward, then another. Income history, asset overview, retirement structure. Everything neat, professional, prepared. I was a senior executive for over 3 decades, I continued. My retirement income alone exceeds what you assumed I needed help with. The apartment you consider modest is owned outright. The house my son believes belongs to the family is legally mine, always has been. My son looked up at me then, shock flooding his face. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because you never needed to know," I replied gently. "Until now." My daughter-in-law's face had gone pale, not embarrassed anymore, alarmed. This was not the version of me she had built her strategy around. Her mother recovered first. She forced a laugh. "Well, that's wonderful news," she said too brightly. "We had no idea. This changes things." I tilted my head. "It changes nothing. It reveals everything." Her father's posture shifted. He sat back, reassessing, recalculating. People like him do math quickly when the numbers surprise them. "All those conversations," I said calmly, "about allowances, about facilities, about burden, they were based on a lie you created. And I allowed." My son swallowed hard. "You let us believe you were struggling." "I let you believe I was simple," I corrected. "There's a difference." Silence filled the space again. This time, it wasn't anticipation. It was shock. "You offered me money to disappear," I continued, "to step back, to stay quiet, not because I needed help, but because you wanted control." Her father started to speak. I raised a hand. He stopped. "Authority recognizes authority. You assumed I was weak because I didn't display strength," I said. "You assumed I was poor because I didn't perform wealth. You assumed I was powerless because I didn't compete." I closed the portfolio. "That was your mistake." My daughter-in-law finally spoke, her voice tight. "Why are you telling us this now?" I looked at her steadily. "Because you crossed from disrespect into coercion, and I don't tolerate that." My son looked like the ground had shifted beneath him. "All this time," he said quietly, "you didn't say anything." "I was watching," I replied, "and you were learning." That hurt him, I could see it. But lessons delayed are not lessons avoided. Her father cleared his throat. "If we misunderstood, you didn't misunderstand," I interrupted calmly. "You revealed yourselves." The weight of that sentence settled slowly. They were no longer in control of the narrative. They were reacting, not directing. "And now," I continued, "we will reset expectations." They leaned in instinctively. People always listen more closely when power shifts. "This is not a negotiation," I said. "This is disclosure. I am financially independent. I require no support. I accept no conditions. And any further attempts to manage my life will be treated as what they are." Her mother's voice trembled. "And what is that?" "Elder financial abuse," I said, without raising my voice. The words changed the room. The word abuse did not need emphasis. It did its work on its own. It settled into the room heavy and precise, forcing everyone present to reconsider not just the conversation, but their position within it. People who rely on social dominance rarely prepare for legal language. Law has a way of stripping emotion down to consequence. My daughter-in-law's mother was the first to react. Her hands tightened around her napkin. "That's a very strong accusation," she said carefully, as if choosing the wrong word might trigger something irreversible. "It's not an accusation," I replied. "It's a classification." Her father shifted in his seat. The confidence he once wore so easily had thinned. He glanced at the documents again, then at me, recalculating not just wealth, but exposure. "We never intended harm," he said. "This was about protecting the family. Protecting yourselves," I corrected, "from a presence you couldn't control." My son's face had changed completely now. The shock was giving way to something deeper. Shame, perhaps. or grief for a version of his mother he had never truly known. "All those times," he said quietly. "You let them talk to you like that." "I did," I answered, "because I needed to know whether you would stop it." His breath caught. That landed where it needed to. My daughter-in-law looked at me then, really looked. Not with embarrassment, not with pity, but with fear. Fear born from miscalculation. She had built her confidence on an incorrect hierarchy, and now the ground beneath it had collapsed. "You could have told us," she said, voice unsteady. "I could have," I agreed, "but then you would have behaved differently, and I needed to see who you were when you thought I had nothing." The table was silent again. No clinking glasses, no background laughter. Just the quiet hum of a room that had lost control of its own narrative. Her father tried once more. "Surely we can move past this, now that everything is clear." I shook my head slightly. Clarity doesn't erase intent, it exposes it. I turned to my son. "What happens next depends on you," I said calmly, "not on them." He looked at his wife, then at her parents, then back at me. The weight of that choice pressed visibly against his chest. For the first time, he understood that neutrality was no longer possible. Silence had consequences now. "They shouldn't have done this," he said finally. The words were quiet, but they were his. "This wasn't okay." His wife stiffened. Her mother opened her mouth to protest. He raised a hand. "No," he continued. "I didn't see it before, but I see it now." I said nothing. This was his moment, not mine. Her father leaned back, defeated but not apologetic. People like him rarely apologize, they retreat instead. "If this is how you feel," he said coolly, "then perhaps we should all take some time." "Time is fine," I replied. "Distance is mandatory." That surprised them. Boundaries always do. "I will not be discussed as a problem to be solved," I continued. "I will not be offered money to erase myself, and I will not tolerate further attempts to access my finances, my decisions, or my autonomy." I looked directly at my daughter-in-law. "If you want a relationship with me," I said, "it will be built on respect, not hierarchy." She nodded slowly. She did not trust herself to speak. I gathered my portfolio and stood. This time no one tried to stop me. Authority had shifted, and everyone felt it. As I walked away from the table, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just alignment. The truth, once released, has a way of restoring balance without theatrics. Outside, the night air was cool, clean. I breathed deeply, feeling the quiet settle back into me. I had not revealed myself to intimidate. I had revealed myself to end the game. They would talk after this. Of course they would, but the tone would be different, the assumptions gone, the leverage gone. When people know you are watching, they behave more carefully. Back in my apartment, I placed the portfolio back in its drawer and locked it. Some truths are tools, not trophies. I had used mine precisely once. That was enough. I looked again at my son's photograph, the same smile, now layered with understanding. He would struggle for a while. Growth often hurts, but he would not forget this moment. None of them would. Quiet justice does not announce victory. It restores order. It corrects imbalance, and then it steps back into silence. The shift after that night was immediate, even if no one dared to name it. Power doesn't apologize when it loses ground. It rebrands, recalculates, then tries again with cleaner gloves. I expected calls wrapped in politeness, invitations framed as peace offerings, little gestures meant to prove they were reasonable people. What I didn't expect was how quickly discomfort would expose what their confidence had been hiding all along. A week later, my son asked if we could meet again. Just to talk. The phrase sounded harmless, but his voice carried the dull pressure of someone standing between two fires. He chose a restaurant that looked like it had been designed for negotiations. Dark wood, low lighting, private booths, the kind of place where even the silence feels expensive. When I arrived, his wife's parents were already there. They rose to greet me, too formal, too careful, as if one wrong syllable could trigger consequences they were finally starting to believe in. My daughter-in-law smiled the way people smile when they are trying to appear safe. My son looked tired, older than his age, like a man realizing the cost of his own avoidance. We sat. No one touched the menu. They had learned that this wasn't about food. The conversation began with neutral words, the kind families use as a thin blanket over a crack in the floor: traffic, weather, work schedules, an upcoming holiday. Every topic was a detour around the real thing. I let them speak. I listened like I always had, not with impatience, but with precision. Watching wasn't weakness, it was discipline. Then her father did what he always did when he felt cornered. He reached for money like a flare gun. He mentioned a new property they had purchased, a renovation that went way over budget, and he laughed as if excess were proof of achievement. He didn't just tell the story, he performed it, waiting for admiration to land on him like applause. "You're very comfortable spending money," I said calmly, neither impressed nor offended. He smiled, encouraged. "We've earned that right." I looked at him, steady and quiet. "Have you?" The word didn't raise my voice, but it lowered the room. My daughter-in-law's mother's smile froze. My son's eyes flicked up sharply. Her father frowned, as if he had been misheard, because in his world people do not question him at the table. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, tone tightening. "I mean exactly what I said," I replied. "You talk about money the way some people talk about oxygen, like you assume it's always there, and anyone who doesn't have it must be defective." I turned slightly, letting my gaze include the whole table. "For months I listened to you measure human worth by visible symbols. Watches, restaurants, cars, real estate. Numbers dropped into conversation like they're medals." I paused, not for drama, but because truth should be placed carefully. "And then you tried to use that same money to purchase my silence." Her mother interjected quickly, trying to reclaim the moral high ground. "We offered support. That's what families do." I nodded once. "Families support. Controlling people by compliance. Don't confuse the two." Her father leaned forward, irritation finally showing beneath the polished veneer. "You're twisting things." "No," I said, calm as a sealed letter. "I'm translating them. You didn't offer help because you were worried about me. You offered money because you wanted my absence. You wanted me to step back so you could control the center." I looked directly at him now, "and the only reason you felt confident enough to try it is because you thought I was poor. You assumed a poor mother has no leverage, no protection, no voice worth respecting. That wasn't a misunderstanding, that was contempt." My daughter-in-law's face flushed. "This is getting ugly," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "It was ugly long before I said it out loud," I replied. "I'm simply removing the makeup." Her father tried to laugh, a short sound meant to dismiss me. "You're acting like we committed a crime." I tilted my head slightly. "You're acting like emotional abuse doesn't count unless it leaves bruises." Silence landed again. My son's shoulders tightened, but he didn't retreat. That was new. Her mother touched her glass but didn't drink, a nervous habit of someone who suddenly realizes the room has shifted. "Let's be honest," I continued. "Money didn't make you better. It exposed you." I let the sentence sit where it belonged. It gave you permission to treat people like objects with price tags. It gave you the arrogance to believe kindness is something you can purchase and dignity is something you can assign. I looked at my daughter-in-law's mother. "You called me simple, as if it were a compliment. You spoke about me as if I were a problem to be managed. You used the word burden without ever looking at my face when you said it." I turned back to her father. "And you asked about my income like a banker assessing a loan risk, not like family." He stiffened. "We were trying to understand the situation." "The situation," I repeated softly, tasting the word. "You mean my existence." My daughter-in-law spoke quickly, desperate to regain control through emotion. "You didn't have to test us like that. If you had told us you were well off, none of this would have happened." I stared at her for a moment, not angry, just disappointed by the honesty of her logic. "Exactly," I said. If I had shown you money, you would have shown me respect. I leaned back slightly. Do you hear yourself? That's the point. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Shame flickered, but it was complicated. People like her don't want to be cruel, they just want comfort, and comfort often demands complicity. Her father snapped, "Who are you to judge our character?" I didn't blink. Someone who has built value instead of buying the appearance of it. He scoffed, "We've worked hard." "I'm sure you believe you have," I said, "but let's separate facts from performance. Tell me what you create that exists without money, not what you purchase, not what you decorate, what you actually build." I waited. They had no answer that didn't loop back to assets, connections, or entitlement. I nodded as if confirming a calculation. That's what I thought. My son finally spoke, voice low but clear. "They treated you like a liability," he said, eyes on his in-laws. "And I let it happen." His wife turned sharply. "Don't do this." He didn't back down. "No, I should do this. I should have done it sooner." He looked at me then, and the pain in his face was real. I didn't understand what silence cost. That sentence mattered more than any apology from them could have, because it wasn't for show. It was admission. I softened my tone, not because they deserved comfort, but because truth doesn't need cruelty to be sharp. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone," I said. "I came here to end a pattern." I looked at her parents again. "You don't get to buy access to my son by buying my disappearance. You don't get to reshape a family by removing the person who built its foundation." I paused. "You also don't get to claim moral superiority while teaching your daughter that respect is reserved for the wealthy." Her mother's voice trembled with anger masked as righteousness. "We want what's best for our daughter. We don't want her dragged down." "There it was, said plainly now." I nodded slowly. "And that is the mask," I said. "You believe human beings drag one another down unless money lifts them up. You believe love is a ladder and marriage is a merger. You believe a mother becomes disposable the moment she's no longer useful." I leaned forward slightly. "But listen to me carefully. Money can buy comfort, but it cannot buy character. Money can buy silence from weak people, but it cannot buy dignity from someone who has already learned to live without your approval." The room had gone so still I could hear the soft scrape of cutlery from another table. Her father's eyes hardened. "So what do you want?" he asked. "An apology? A confession?" "I want boundaries," I replied. "And I want them respected without negotiation." He exhaled sharply. "And if we don't?" "Then I disengage," I said, simple as a verdict. And not quietly. I will document every attempt at coercion, every message, every agreement, every pressure campaign. I will protect myself legally and publicly if necessary. You should understand something. I didn't rise in my career by being sentimental. I rose by being precise. My daughter-in-law's face went pale. Her confidence had been built on the belief that I would remain embarrassed, small, and manageable. Now she saw a woman who could stand calmly in the middle of conflict and never lose control of her voice. That kind of composure terrifies people who rely on intimidation. "This ends now," I said, looking at all of them. "You stop discussing my finances. You stop positioning me as a burden. You stop inserting yourselves into decisions that are not yours. If you want a relationship with me, you earn it the old-fashioned way. Respect, consistency, decency, not money, not pressure, not performance." My son swallowed. He looked like someone waking up after a long, dull dream. His wife stared at the table, and for the first time, she looked less like a strategist and more like a daughter who had been raised inside a script. I stood, calmly, no theatrics. "Money didn't make you better," I said again, softer this time. "It simply gave you permission to show who you already were." I picked up my bag. "Now you know who I am, too." As I walked away, no one stopped me. They didn't even try. Because the mask had been torn off, and once air touches the truth, it's hard to put it back on. Power doesn't fall with a scream. It collapses with a pause. A moment when everyone in the room realizes the rules they relied on no longer apply. That moment arrived quietly, dressed in linen and low lighting, at a restaurant they had chosen because it made them feel untouchable. It was meant to be a dinner to reassert control, one last performance, a chance for them to regain footing after losing the narrative. They invited us, my son and me, under the pretense of moving forward. The phrase was familiar by now, emptied of sincerity through repetition. Still, I agreed, not because I needed closure, but because endings deserve witnesses. The restaurant was full that night, not loud, but alive. The hum of conversations, the clink of glass, the soft choreography of waiters moving with practiced grace. It was the kind of place where wealth expects to be recognized without explanation, a place where people assume payment will be effortless, unquestioned, automatic. We were seated at a wide table near the center of the room. No private booth this time. Visibility matters when people want to feel dominant. Her parents arrived first, composed, smiling, dressed as if confidence could be tailored. My daughter-in-law followed, stiff, alert, her posture betraying the tension she tried to hide. My son arrived last, standing beside me rather than across from me. That small choice didn't go unnoticed. Conversation began politely enough, surface-level words exchanged like formalities before a ceremony. But beneath it all, something was different. The air didn't bend toward them the way it used to. Authority, once questioned, never fully recovers its weight. Her father ordered confidently, barely glancing at prices. Old habits die hard. He spoke loudly, gesturing with the ease of someone used to being deferred to. He talked about connections, about plans, about moving past misunderstandings, the language of someone trying to reclaim center stage. At some point, the waiter approached with a courteous smile. "Shall I bring the check when you're ready?" he asked. "Of course," her father said without hesitation. "Just put it on my card." The words landed as they always had. Final, certain. The waiter nodded and disappeared. Minutes passed, conversation drifted. My daughter-in-law picked at her food. Her mother spoke too quickly, filling space that no longer belonged to her. My son remained quiet, but not withdrawn. He watched. He listened. He was finally learning the same skill that had protected me for decades. The waiter returned, expression unchanged but posture subtly different. He leaned slightly toward her father. "I'm sorry, sir," he said softly. "The card was declined." The sentence cut through the room like glass. Her father laughed reflexively. "That's impossible. Try again." The waiter nodded and stepped back. Silence spread outward. Nearby tables continued their conversations, unaware that a small earthquake had just begun. My daughter-in-law's mother stiffened. My son's eyes flicked briefly toward me, then back to the table. I remained still. The waiter returned again. His voice was lower now. "It's still not going through, sir." Her father's face flushed. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," the waiter replied, polite but firm. "Would you like to try another card?" Her mother reached into her purse too quickly, producing a card with trembling fingers. "Use this one," she said, forcing a smile. The waiter took it. Seconds stretched. My daughter-in-law stared straight ahead, as if movement itself might worsen the situation. This was not about money anymore. It never really had been. It was about exposure. The waiter returned one last time. He paused. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "That card was declined as well." The room felt suddenly colder. Her mother whispered, "That can't be right." Her father's jaw tightened. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the open space, the nearby tables, the eyes that might wander. Authority does not survive embarrassment, it fractures under it. My son exhaled slowly and stood. "I've got it," he said. They both turned to him, stunned. "No," her father said sharply, "absolutely not." My son didn't sit back down. "Yes," he said calmly. "I do." He turned to the waiter. "I'll take care of it." The waiter nodded with quiet relief and handed him the check. Her mother looked at my son as if she were seeing him for the first time. "You don't need to do this," she said. This is just a temporary issue. My son met her gaze. This isn't about money, he said. His voice didn't shake. It's about who you are when things don't go your way. That sentence settled heavily. People nearby might not have heard the words, but they felt the shift. A son standing, a father faltering, a hierarchy collapsing in real time. I stood then, not to intervene, but to conclude. Let me be clear, I said quietly, my voice carrying without effort. This dinner was never about payment. It was about power, and power just changed hands. Her father looked at me, fury and disbelief tangled together. You planned this, he hissed. I shook my head. No, you revealed it. My son paid the bill, not dramatically, not with a flourish, just a card placed on the table, approved without incident. The waiter thanked him and moved away, professionalism intact, dignity restored. That small exchange did more damage to their authority than any argument could have. Her mother sat frozen. Her father stared at the table, his carefully constructed image splintering under the weight of public reality. My daughter-in-law's shoulders sagged. She looked smaller now, not because she lacked worth, but because she had relied too long on borrowed confidence. My son turned to me. Mom, he said, steady and clear, I'm sorry. I nodded once. Forgiveness doesn't require a speech. He then turned to his wife and her parents. What you did to her wasn't protection, he said. It was control, and I won't be part of it. Her mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. There were no words left that could repair this. This ends tonight, my son continued. You don't get to define my mother as a burden. You don't get to buy silence, and you don't get access to our lives if it comes with conditions. Her father finally looked up. You're choosing her over us, he said bitterly. My son didn't hesitate. I'm choosing integrity. That was the moment everything truly collapsed. Not the declined cards, not the stares, not the embarrassment, but the realization that their leverage was gone, completely, irretrievably. I placed a hand on my son's arm. This isn't about sides, I said softly. It's about standards. He nodded. We gathered our things. As we stood to leave, I felt the eyes of the room shift briefly toward us, drawn not by drama, but by resolution. Justice doesn't always look like a verdict. Sometimes it looks like a son paying a bill and standing up straight. As we walked away, I heard her father mutter something under his breath. It didn't matter. Words spoken after power is lost carry no weight. Outside, the night air felt different, lighter. My son walked beside me, not ahead, not behind. Equal. I should have seen it sooner, he said quietly. You saw it when you were ready, I replied. That's enough. Behind us, the restaurant returned to its rhythm. Plates cleared, tables reset, life moved on. But something irreversible had occurred. Their power had collapsed not because they lost money, but because they lost the authority to define others. And once that happens, nothing you own can buy it back. Justice had been served, not loudly, not violently, but completely. Justice does not always arrive with consequences others can see. Sometimes it arrives with absence, with doors that no longer open, with access quietly revoked. That kind of justice leaves no bruises, no headlines, no arguments to replay. It leaves something far more difficult to escape, shame paired with limits. I didn't announce my departure. I didn't send messages explaining my decision. I didn't demand apologies or closure. I simply stepped back, the way one steps away from a fire after realizing it was never meant to keep you warm. The night I chose to leave things as they were, I walked alone through the city. The lights were bright, indifferent, beautiful in their indifference. Cars passed. People laughed somewhere behind glass. Life continued without waiting for my approval. That felt right. Justice, I realized, doesn't pause the world. It corrects your place within it. I stopped answering certain calls, not dramatically, not abruptly, just selectively. Messages that carried pressure went unanswered. Invitations framed as obligation dissolved into silence. I didn't block anyone. Blocking invites pursuit. Silence teaches boundaries. They noticed, of course. People accustomed to control always do. At first, confusion, then irritation, then the subtle reach-outs meant to test whether the line was real, polite check-ins, concerned questions, a sudden warmth that arrived too late to feel genuine. I didn't respond. This wasn't punishment, it was alignment. I had spent years believing that restraint meant endurance, that dignity required staying, explaining, absorbing. I learned instead that dignity sometimes requires departure, not as an act of anger, but as an act of self-respect. Quiet justice doesn't argue, it withdraws consent. My son understood, not immediately, but deeply. We spoke once, clearly, without emotion clouding the words. I told him what my absence from certain spaces meant and what it didn't. It didn't mean abandonment. It didn't mean resentment. It meant I would no longer participate in dynamics that required me to shrink. You don't need to choose sides, I told him. You need to choose standards. He nodded. He had learned that lesson the hard way. The others were left with something far more uncomfortable than confrontation. They were left with themselves, with dinners where my chair remained empty, with conversations that stalled when my name came up, with the unspoken knowledge that the person they tried to manage had simply removed herself from the board. They lost nothing tangible. No money, no property, no status on paper. What they lost was control. Control over narrative, control over access, control over the illusion that their approval mattered. Shame crept in quietly, the way it does when there's no one to argue with. Shame thrives in silence. It grows when there is no audience to reassure you that you were right, when no one returns your justifications, when your power fails to provoke reaction. I didn't correct their version of events. Letting people believe what they need to believe is often the most efficient boundary. Truth doesn't require participation to exist. I returned to my routines. Morning walks, evenings on the balcony, meals cooked slowly, intentionally. I filled my days with things that didn't demand explanation. The nervous vigilance I once carried, anticipating slights, preparing responses, began to dissolve. Peace arrived not as relief, but as space. There were moments, of course, when memory surfaced, a look, a phrase, a table where I once sat diminished. Healing does not erase memory. It changes how memory lives in the body. The memories came and went without gripping me. They no longer asked for defense. One evening, as I walked past a familiar restaurant, I caught my reflection in the glass. Older, yes, softer around the edges, but upright, unburdened. I realized then that I hadn't won anything. Winning would have required an opponent worth engaging. What I had done instead was step into my own authority and close the door quietly behind me. You didn't lose money, you lost control. And control, once lost without a fight, is nearly impossible to reclaim. I didn't need to teach them a lesson. Life would do that on its own. People who mistake power for worth eventually face a world that doesn't respond to leverage. They spend their days trying to recreate a feeling they once had, wondering why it doesn't land anymore. I chose not to watch. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors you decide when to open. Mine remained closed, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Quiet justice is not revenge, it's resolution. And in that resolution, I finally felt free. Not because I was proven right, but because I no longer needed to be understood by those who never intended to listen. I walked on, the city lights stretching ahead of me, calm and certain. Healing doesn't arrive like forgiveness in movies. It doesn't sweep in with dramatic apologies or perfectly timed realizations. It comes quietly, in moments that feel almost ordinary, until you realize something inside you has finally loosened its grip. The morning after everything ended, I woke before sunrise, not because of worry, not because of unfinished thoughts, simply because my body was ready to begin again. The city was still half asleep when I stepped onto the balcony, wrapped in a light sweater, the air cool and honest against my skin. The sky was changing slowly, almost shyly, from deep blue to soft gold. No audience, no witnesses, just light returning to its place. For the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel the need to prepare myself for anyone. I had spent decades being careful. Careful with words, careful with presence, careful with how much of myself I allowed the world to see. That caution had once been necessary. It had protected me, sharpened me, helped me survive, but protection, if held too long, can become a cage. I hadn't realized how heavy it was until I finally set it down. My son joined me on the balcony a few minutes later. He moved quietly, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether silence was what I needed. That uncertainty was new for him. He had always known me as steady, contained, unshakable. Now he was learning that strength could also include rest. "I didn't sleep much," he said softly. I smiled. Neither did I. But not for the same reasons. We stood side by side, watching the horizon shift. No tension, no urgency, just space. "I keep replaying everything," he admitted. "All the times I stayed quiet, all the moments I should have spoken up. Regret has a way of arriving late, once the danger has passed." "You did what you knew how to do then," I replied. "That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." He looked at me surprised. "You're not angry?" "I was never angry," I said honestly. "I was disappointed. There's a difference." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I thought neutrality would keep the peace," he said. "I didn't realize it was costing you." "It cost you too," I said gently. "You just didn't feel it yet." That truth settled between us. Not heavy, just real. We talked for a long time that morning, not about money, not about the past in detail, but about boundaries, about what our relationship would look like going forward. I told him what I needed now, not as a sacrifice, but as a condition for closeness, respect, transparency, presence without permission from others. "I won't compete for space in your life," I told him, "but I won't accept being minimized either." He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He listened. And when he spoke, his voice was clear. "I want you in my life," he said. "Not as an obligation, as a choice." That mattered. Healing, I learned, is not about restoring what was broken. It's about building what was never allowed to exist. For years, our relationship had been shaped by roles instead of truth. The strong mother, the independent son, the unspoken expectations. Now, stripped of performance, something more honest could finally take shape. Later that day, after he left, I stayed on the balcony alone. The sun was fully up now, bathing the city in warmth. People were waking, moving, beginning their own routines. Somewhere below, life continued as it always had. But inside me, something had shifted permanently. For the first time, I didn't hide who I was. Not from shame, not from strategy, not from fear. I had spent so long believing that silence was my strength, and for a time, it was. But strength evolves. What protects you in one season can limit you in another. Letting go of silence didn't make me louder. It made me lighter. In the weeks that followed, I noticed the changes in small, quiet ways. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head before they happened. I no longer felt the need to explain myself to people who had already decided who I was. That alone felt like freedom. I began doing things simply because I wanted to. Long walks in the morning, coffee with old friends I had neglected while being busy staying invisible, reading without interruption, cooking meals that took time instead of efficiency, living, not managing. I didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. Not my resilience, not my intelligence, not my worth. The world didn't change because I revealed myself. I did. And that was enough. My son visited often. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we sat in silence that felt companionable instead of strained. He no longer tried to fix things with gestures or apologies. He showed up. That was the difference. As for the others, distance did its quiet work. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no explosive endings, just a gradual understanding that access to my life was no longer automatic. It was intentional. Boundaries, once established, have a way of educating people without argument. I didn't feel bitterness toward them. Bitterness requires investment. I had withdrawn mine. Standing on the balcony one evening, weeks later, watching the sun dip below the buildings, I realized something simple and profound. I had lived much of my life preparing for storms, for conflict, for defense. Now there was no storm to prepare for, just weather, passing, manageable. Healing didn't mean forgetting what happened. It meant no longer living inside it. I had chosen myself, not over my son, not against anyone, just for myself. And in that choice, I found something I hadn't known I was missing. Peace that didn't need to be earned. Strength that didn't need to be hidden. A life that didn't need witnesses to be real. For the first time, I wasn't surviving. I was simply living.